Kalabrien konnten die Anjou
zum zweiten Referat über von Gabriele Passabì und der wird auf Englisch referieren. Hallo Gabriele, ich werde ihn dementsprechend auch auf Englisch kurz vorstellen. Gabriele Passabì, after graduating from the University of Siena with a BA in History and with an MA in Medieval History at King's College London, in March 2021 had been awarded a PhD in History from the University of Cambridge with a thesis titled Chronographia and Imperium, continuing the chronicle tradition of Eusebius Jerome and Sigbert of Gembloux in 12th century Normandy. The thesis investigated the rise of universal chronicle writing and ideas of time, universality and power in 12th century Normandy, with a special focus on the chronicle of Robert of Torigny. Currently, Gabriele Passabì is a postdoctoral research fellow at TriKo, Trierer Kolleg für Mittelalter und Neuzeit, where he works on a project analyzing the writing of world chronicles in England and southern Italy in the long 12th century. We are pleased to gain an insight into your recent studies in Trier, and I pass the word to you. And please, if you continue with the PowerPoint, feel free to share.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. I'll proceed with sharing the PowerPoint. There we go. Yes, so again, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm honored to present the early results of my research here in Trier. I apologize for using English as language for this paper. So the writing of history in the Middle Ages was grounded on the gathering of information, notitia, about the events and compiled them in a coherent narrative. Within universal chronicle writing, this practice was especially paramount. In the Middle Ages, a universal or a world chronicle was an historiographical work that recounted the history of the world from biblical creation or the incarnation down to the chronicler's own time. It will help to think of war chronicles as history databases, collecting information about past and present events and arranging them in chronological order. Chroniclers, in fact, included the history of their own community, be it local or national, alongside the known history of contemporary kingdoms and empires, going as far back as the creation. Universal chronicles were therefore based on the systematic harvest of information about the past from the available sources, and more importantly, the coherent re-elaboration of this information within the history of the world. The roots of the genre dated back to late antiquity with the works of Eusebius Caesarea and Jerome. It was particularly popular in 11th century Germany in the territories of the empire with the works of Otto Michelsberg, Sigurd of Gembloux, Eckhard of Aura. In 12th century southern Italy, the Archbishop of Salerno, Romualdo Guarna, endeavored in writing a universal chronicle, starting with creation and accounting the history of the world down to 1178. Romualdo conceived this chronicle as a continuation of B. de Venerable's world history, the Chronica Maiora, which he expanded with the account concerning ancient Roman, Lombard, Frankish, and Norman past. Recent studies by Marino Zabbia have reassessed Romualdo's authorship and usage of the sources, yet the rationale grounding Romualdo's information processes has remained in the background. If on the one hand, Romualdo's approach to chronicle writing encompasses the whole of history since creation as the manifestation of God's will, the writing of the chronicle occurred at a specific time and under specific circumstances. The resolution of the schism between Pope Alexander III and Emperor Barbarossa at the Peace of Venice in 1177. After 18 years of conflict, and more specifically, the prime role played by the Sicilian king William II at the negotiations. This paper will therefore investigate the strategies implemented by Romualdo in updating and continuing Bede's chronicle, with special reference to the Norman past. By taking into account the political horizon of the chronicle, it is possible to investigate the rationale that guided Romualdo in rewriting the past with Norman history, and the way he used and elaborated information to achieve what I will call Romualdo's politics of time. Born between 1110 and 1120 in a princely family of Salerno, Romualdo Garna had an important role within the royal court of Palermo at the time of William I and William II. After studying medicine and theology at the University of Salerno, Romualdo became Archbishop of that city in 1153. This office allowed him to participate directly in the political life of his time. In fact, as he reports in his own chronicle, when William I fell sick in 1166, the king wanted the archbishop by his side to treat him with his medical knowledge. Unfortunately for the king, Romualdo's cures were not sufficient, and the king died shortly afterwards. Nonetheless, Romualdo fulfilled an highest honor by crowning the successor of William I, William II, in the Cathedral of Palermo. But the young king was still a boy at the time after the coronation, and Romualdo still played a key role during the king's minority, led by his mother, Margherita of Navarra, the Englishman Richard Palmer, Bishop of Syracuse, and the noble Matteo d'Aiello. If we are to believe Romualdo's contemporary, Ugo Falcando, Romualdo even plotted against Richard Palmer to replace him as a familiaris, as a member of the court in Sicily. Whether or not Romualdo Falcando's accusations are correct, there is no doubt that Romualdo was a man of the court, a man of power. Romualdo's political career reached its climax when he was called to represent the interests of the Sicilian king, allied of Pope Alexander III, at the Peace of Venice in 1177. The peace put an end to the Alexandrine schism that had started in 1159 and Barbarossa's claims of hegemony over Italy. But Romualdo's approach to history, however, encompasses the whole of Bede's chronicle. Bede's, writing in the 8th century, had originally conceived this chronicle as chapter 66 of a larger work on the reckoning of time, the Temporum Ratione. Following Augustine's divisions into the 6 ages of the world, Bede's chronicle covered the history of the world from creation up to 725. The Chronica Maior enjoyed a wide circulation from the 10th to the 12th century as an independent text, especially in southern Italy, where it is attested at Monte Cassino and at the Abbey of Cava dei Tirreni. Romualdo kept Bede's chronological framework somewhat coherently throughout the text of his chronicle. He, for instance, kept the division in ages, which are reported in the manuscript in rubrics, but also kept the chronological frameworks of Bede's chronicle by reporting at the end of each entry the Anno Mundi, the year of the world, since the creation of the world before the incarnation, and the Anni Domini after the incarnation. Still, the Peace of Venice represented a textual center of gravity for the whole chronicle. In fact, after the entry for the year 1177, the Archbishop dedicated over 55 folia only to the very accurate description of this very event, reporting the negotiations and the role played by himself as representative of the kings of Sicily, but also by the other conveners. To an extent, he expanded the place of memory of the Peace of Venice as a crucial event of salvation history, the singularity towards which the whole of history since creation was unfolding. For this reason, it is necessary to keep in mind this important event to reconstruct the approach that Romualdo showed in the reconstruction of the past. He's very careful, however, in reconstructing the whole of history. In fact, he interpolated Bede's account with events about biblical history, using the Bible, or better, the historical books of the Bible, such as Chronicles, the Book of Kings, to expand on the history of biblical history. But the same approach is used to expand on Roman history using Orosius' History Against the Pagans. But for Lombard history is one of these major contributions, for he used the Historia Longobardorum by Paul the Deacon, but also the same for Frankish history, using the histories of Gregory of Tours, but also Einard's Life of Charlemagne. Romualdus' project thus comprised a thorough rewriting of Bede's chronicle to expound the world's past with new information. But at the same time, he elevated the past of southern Italy, especially Lombard and Norman, as a central stage within God's plan. In this process, however, the way the information of the past are reframed is crucial, and it can be seen that to an extent Romualdo replaced the unevenness of historical process with a narrative continuity. As for Norman history, in fact, he used a rich library which he had at his disposal, which comprised the Chronicle Monasteri Casinensi, a Monte Cassino chronicle by Leone Marsicano and continued by Pietro Diacono, and especially the Chronicon Amalfitano, or more likely a common Norman source, which, as shown by Marino Zabbia, was Romualdo's main source, along with Lupus Protospater's Chronicon. The Norman past is particularly controversial, however, for Romualdo Guarna, because although by the time Romualdo was writing, the William II of Sicily had become a staunch supporter of Alexander III and a key player in the Peace of Venice, the recent Norman past had not been characterized by a peaceful relationship with the popes. Quite the reverse. During the late 11th and early 12th century, the legitimacy of the Norman kingdom relied upon the recognition of the popes as much as the popes relied on the Normans for protection against the emperors, especially during the investiture controversy. Yet the Normans had built their power in Apulia through military conquest, sometimes at the expense of the papacy. The first appearance of the Normans in Romualdo's history is found in the entry for the year 997, where Romualdo, after mentioning the death of Hugh Capet and the succession of his son Robert, reports that at the same time, the Catepano Melo of Bari led a retinue of Normans in Apulia, fought against the Greeks at Besentello, and seized the city of Ascoli. In the entry for 1001, again, we found another reference to the conquest of Apulia by Melo of Bari, along with the Normans. Here, Romualdo refers most likely to the anti-Byzantine rebellion of Bari, Trani, and Bitonto, which had actually occurred in 1009 or 1010. Following the inaccurate narrative of the Amalfi Chronicle, Romualdo emphasized Melo's conquest of the whole of Apulia along with the Normans, but he omitted, for instance, Melo's failure of his rebellion, and he failed to mention the Battle of Cannae in 1018, where the Byzantine troops of Basilius by Ioannes defeated the rebels and caused even the death of the Norman leader, Gilbert Drengot. In a way, Romualdo selected the information from his sources to lay the ground for a linear narrative of the conquest by the Normans, which will reach its climax with the deeds of Robert Guiscard. Since the early 11th century, in fact, the Altavilla brothers Humphrey and Robert Guiscard, along with Richard Drengot, had begun a systematic conquest of southern Italy at the expense of the neighboring Lombard principalities and especially the papacy. Pope Leo IX, who was particularly worried about the growing power of the Altavilla, decided to topple Norman power there and take direct control of the Mezzogiorno. Leo IX, in fact, mustered an anti-Norman alliance that involved, along with the imperial troops sent by Henry III, also the Lombard leaders Rodolfo, Prince of Benevento, Atenolfo I, Duke of Gaeta, Count of Aquino, and the Archbishop and citizens of Amalfi. War was therefore inevitable. The battle, in fact, took place in Capitanata, close to Civitate, on 18th June 1053. The outcome of the battle was, however, unprecedented. The Norman forces, led by Humphrey, Richard Drengot, and Robert Guiscard, destroyed the papal troops, and even Pope Leo IX, who had ridden with his army into battle, was taken a prisoner in Benevento for 9 months. The Battle of Civitate was a game changer for the relationship between the papacy and the Normans. Following the papal defeat, in fact, the Treaty of Melfi, confirmed by the Concordat of Melfi of 1059, signed by Leo's successor, Nicholas II, officially recognized the Norman conquest in Apulia. In reporting the events about Civitate, however, Romualdo uses a different approach, and which is a clear example of his strategy in re-elaborating the information. Romualdo, in fact, charged the German imperial troops with the responsibility of defeat against the Normans, as he writes, and I quote, "Having been admonished by Emperor Henry with many prayers by the suggestions of some of the Salernitans, Pope Leo arrived at Benevento to expel the Normans from Apulia. From thence he moved, together with the Germans, whom the Emperor had directed within, at a city named Civitate, which is on the borders of the Samnius and Apulia, and fought vigorously with the Normans. Having committed to battle, the Normans defeated the whole army of the Germans with the edge of the sword." According to William of Apulia, only 700 Swabians really fought at Civitate, whilst most of the army, led by the Pope, comprised Salernitans, Capuans, Romans, and people from Soleto, Sabina, and Fermo. Romualdo therefore diminished not only the role of his fellow Lombards, but also the direct involvement of the Pope. He did not omit the participation of the Pope to the battle, but he did omit instead his capture by simply writing, here I quote again, "Since Pope Leo was not able to achieve what he had come for, he returned back." The chronicle of Leone Marsicano, which Romualdo had at his disposal and used as a source, does report the Pope's capture by Humphrey Altavilla, who took him as a prisoner for 9 months from late June 1053 to March 1054. Humphrey released the Pope only when Leo fell sick during his captivity and would in fact die shortly afterwards in 1054. By glossing over on the Pope's imprisonment, Romualdo in a way diminished the Norman violence against the popes and attributed instead to the Normans the glory of military victory against the German imperial troops. Both the Amalfi Chronicle and Romualdo's Chronicle share the same reading of the event, even though there are some important changes. Romualdo, in fact, continues his exposition on the Battle of Civitate by writing that Leo IX had been the first among the Roman popes to wage war from Rome cum mano armatorum, by the hand of armed men. Although he had been a saint and had done this with pious spirit, this act was still an act of war and did not pertain to papal office. For this reason, the multitude of the Pope's army had been destroyed at Civitate in front of his eyes, granting victory to the Normans. Guarna's reflection here, I think, moves on two trails which are difficult to reconcile. On the one hand, the Battle of Civitate confirmed the Norman power hold in Apulia and ushered the forthcoming conquest of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily by Robert Guiscard and Roger I. On the other hand, the battle was also the first time that a pope had led an army in battle, an event that Romualdo judged as contrary to the papal office and God's will. If we keep in mind the contemporary context of writing in the late 1170s, we can see why this is important. Romualdo's support for Alexander III, in opposition to Frederick Barbarossa, compelled him to elaborate the information about Civitate, emphasizing the German imperial troops as the only defeated force in battle. At the same time, however, he could not avoid pondering on the fact that Pope Leo had mastered an army himself and then led it in battle against the Normans. According to the Amalfi Chronicle and Guarna himself, the Pope had stepped away from the official religious call of his office, thus contradicting Christ's instruction for a peaceful ecclesia. The Pope military defeat was therefore a sign of God, who punished the Pope for acting as a secular prince. In fact, Romualdo continues by writing that the Lord did not instruct his disciples, and in turn the apostles, their successors, that is, the popes, so that they would protect God's people from worldly hardship by means of the secular sword, materiali gladio, like secular princes, but so that they would advise with word of doctrine and teach with the example of a pious conduct. Whilst the anti-Gregorian undertones of these passages are very evident, if we compare this text with the text of the Chronicle Amalfitano, which was the source for this passage, there are some important changes. The author of the Amalfi Chronicle, in fact, is more explicit in articulating the political implications of the papal defeat at Civitate. In fact, he openly accused the Pope of leading God's people to ruin, populum corruerent, by following the conduct of a secular prince, mastering armies and claiming land rights. Romualdo partially accepted the text, and thus the interpretation of the events presented in the Amalfi Chronicle, which depicted Norman victory against the Pope as God ordained. At the same time, Romualdo could not entirely accept a narrative that described the papal office as breaking the unity of God's church. Overall, Romualdo had to find a compromise between these two conflicting interpretations. On the one hand, he decided to omit the Pope's humiliation by the hands of the Normans and soften the pro-Norman language of the Chronicle Amalfitano. At the same time, he did not omit the implications of a papal defeat as a manifestation of God's will, and therefore the sign of Norman greatness within the plan of God. The same difficulty in reconciling a narrative continuity and the contrasted past of the kings of Sicily with the popes emerges in the account concerning the events leading to the very foundation of the Kingdom of Sicily by Roger II, 1130. After the death of Honore II, part of the cardinals, led by Chancellor Aimeric de la Châtre, elected Gregorio Papareschi as Pope Innocent II. But the rest of them refused to recognize him as Pope and elected Pietro Pierleone as Anacletus II. Although Anacletus had supported some of the cardinals, Innocent II was considered the legitimate Pope by the most of Christianity, really, Anacletus an anti-Pope. Roger II was, however, the principal supporter of the rival Pope Anacletus II, and kingship was the price for his support. It was in fact Anacletus who had first sanctioned the creation of the Kingdom of Sicily in a bull dated on 27 September 1130. Romualdo, on the other hand, supported Alexander II, as shown in his entry reporting on the events of the schism, which he extracted from a papal source, the life of Innocent II by Boso, as extant in the Liber Pontificalis. Yet again, Romualdo was faced with a conflicting choice. On the one hand, he coherently stood by a papal interpretation of history, supporting Innocent II in the account of the past, as he supported Alexander III in the present. However, this choice risked invalidating the legitimacy of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which he had served with a passion and officially represented at the Peace of Venice. As in the case for the Battle of Civitate, the elaboration of the information within his chronicle allowed him to find a compromise. After reporting on Roger's election as Duke of Apulia, which happened in 1128, he very briefly reported that, and I quote, after a while, he, Roger II, had himself anointed and crowned king in Palermo by the council of the barons and the peoples. Only afterwards, when recounting King Roger's 10 years long military campaign against the rebellious barons of southern Italy, did Romualdo mention again the schism and the background for Innocent II's exile in France and the continental campaigns of Roger himself. Romualdo, however, never explained the reasons of the rebels, nor did he mention Anacletus' agency in creating Roger's kingship. Instead, he carefully described Roger's deeds aiming to bring peace in southern Italy and subdue to his command the rebellious barons. In conclusion, a strongly biased towards fact-oriented data collection, universal chronicle writing relied on the gathering and processing of information, whose practice were oriented by present-time concerns. Romualdo's elaboration of the information within his chronicle was not just an absent-minded copy-pasting of extracts from other sources. The context of the Peace of Venice represented not only the end term of Romualdo's timeline, but also the political heavyweight that influenced the very direction that Romualdo envisioned for his reconstruction of universal history. While updating Bede's chronicle, Romualdo enhanced the role of the Normans in the providential plan of God in view of their future achievement, the creation of a kingdom whose representatives will sit at the same table with popes and emperors. However, when faced with the risk of writing the recent Norman past of southern Italy, Romualdo elaborated the information about this very Norman past, diminishing or removing the open conflict with the papacy. Romualdo processed the information about the events in a way, therefore, that simplified historical process and replacing complexity and conflict for linearity. In a way, he smoothed the unevenness of the past in view of the contemporary context, a time when the kings of Sicily negotiated with Barbarossa's defeat on the side of Pope Alexander, and, according to Romualdo, took a central stage in history itself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Gabriele, thank you very much for your talk. Could we allow the audience to ask questions in German and you answer in German, English, or Italian?
In English or Italian will be best.
So, but we can ask questions in German and then...
if it's possible to translate them a bit will be best.
We should have discussed this before.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, then we stay with English or Italian. And
absolutely.
Then, okay, we open the floor for questions. Let's see in the auditorium or online. Okay, then I just start. I got a couple of questions, which naturally comes from my distance to your subject. So please forgive me if these are not like the type of professional questions you are used to. Is there any, let's say, person behind Romualdo who contradicted his ambitions or his chronic with the political strategy of the king? So that is one question. And the other is, which sources did Romualdo use himself? You mentioned a couple of sources, but I don't know them. So I'm interested in the contemporary effect of these sources, where they're popular, where they're known, where they're political fact. So I imagine that the quantity of people able to reading these chronicles was little. So it was a political game at the same time, I guess.
Well, thank you very much for your questions. They are really interesting indeed. As for the first question, whether there is context to counterbalance basically Romualdo's approach to history, there has been a very important article back in the 60s by Hartmut Hoffmann, who compared and actually contrasted on the one side Ugo Falcando, who was a member of the Sicilian court and an inner connoisseur of the political maneuvering of the court, and Romualdo. And the two approaches are very, very different, but at the same time, there has been debate on whether Romualdo was really writing his chronicle in response to Ugo Falcando's accusation, because Ugo Falcando really subtly refers to the fact that Romualdo was one of the plotter against Richard Palmer. He wanted to become a member of the court. He possibly wanted to become Archbishop of Palermo, and was very possibly disappointed when William of Perche was instead elected. And Romualdo wanted, in a sense, to correct the history that Ugo Falcando was writing, and where evidence there was circulating already in the 70s. The two writers are more or less contemporary. But this is a bit, I think, a bit of a stretch, because the ambition of Romualdo is extraordinarily massive. in including in trying to really mix and patch the history using a very much vast array of sources. As for the sources, in fact, for Norman history, these sources were very much known, and they, especially Leone, as was saying, the Chronicle of Monte Cassino, the Chronicle of Lupo Protospatas, these are very much Norman sources that present a very Norman representation of the events, especially an Altavilla interpretation of the events leading to the conquest. And they were known. So Romualdo is already taking into his universal history a very much Altavilla interpretation of history. As for the rest, which I didn't have the time to cover in my talk, Romualdo is very, very thorough in reconstructing the history of the Lombards, for instance, of which he is really careful about. And for this, he used, as I was saying, a vast array of sources, which includes Paul the Deacon, but also some Monte Cassino collection of chronicles and annals, of which he had at the disposal. So he's trying to fix into a very wide understanding of history all the past of southern Italy in a way that could justify really the current states of affairs, where the Lombards are not there anymore as an independent force, and the Normans instead are not only the leaders in southern Italy, but really much affirming themselves at an international stage. Hence this international, we would say even global approach to history. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. So I have a quick look if somebody else is interested in the question. So regarding your recent research work, one of your approaches is to show the rise of universal chronicle writing. Can you connect this internationality of chronicle writing in its time to give us an idea of how chronicles were recepted among other chronicle writers within Europe? So did they read themselves? Was there a network that allowed the thesis that there was a rise of a universal chronicle writing?
Well, this is a really good question. And for a long time in southern Italy, Romualdo's chronicle has been interpreted as the only universal chronicle ever written, which has these characters. However, if we look, there are other sources later on, such as the Chronicon Fosse Nove, which is finished in 1216, the Chronica Santa Maria di Ferrara, again, finished in 1228, so in the long 12th century, let's say. But all of these chronicles have in common the approach to universality by continuing a very authoritative text. In southern Italy, Bede's chronicle is the authority that is continued by the chroniclers. And as you were saying, to identify the connection, the international collection is difficult because we have to match the reality of manuscript transmission and circulation, which is local. But if we move, for instance, our focus from southern Italy to northern Europe and looking at Normandy and England, around this time, we have, let's say, continental chronicles, European chronicles being copied and transmitted in England, both coming from 8th century. I'm thinking of from Carolingian times in general, like Ado of Vienne, but also Freckles of Lisieux being copied in 12th century England, but also in northern France. We have, let's say, native English chronicles being copied, such as Bede, which is it enjoys a wide circulation throughout Europe at this time. And it's interesting to see that, especially chapter 66 of his larger work, which is a very technical tracked on the reckoning of time. We focus on the on seasons, how to calculate exactly the indiction and all this very technical, or the date of Easter, which is the main problem for beads. But still, chapter 66 from the 10th to the 12th century is removed from the whole text and starts circulating widely all over Europe. And I think that there is a sense that in the 12th century, many chroniclers are trying to think the past into these global terms. In England, we have John of Worcester, Ralph of Daisito, Ralph Niger, and eventually, if I don't go into the late second half of the 13th century, but a big name will be Matthew Paris, who wrote a massive chronicle around this time. So I think there is an intellectual interest in thinking history within this larger framework. And I'm trying to understand, this is a very early stage of my research, looking at this wider context, but I'm trying to see how this interest emerges.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have another look. Okay. Yeah, maybe regarding, if I may, so I ask another question, and then maybe that's about it. You mentioned the dispute between Romualdo and William I. Can you define a sympathy or anti-sympathy of Romualdo versus the king? You said his writing wasn't in favor for the king, but were there political consequences for Romualdo? You mentioned the king died shortly afterwards, if I remember right.
Ah, yeah. Well,
I'm interested knowing that chronicles normally are written in favor of the potential the king, so I was surprised to hear that he formulated a contraposition.
Did I say that? No, in the sense that
I was surprised that Romualdo formulated
I'm sorry, baby, but I didn't mean to say that, because Romualdo is really much writing in favor of William I. Actually, it really takes pride of his closeness, especially with William I. The only moment in which Romualdo and the king and William I are in contrast is when there is another rebellion by the Apulian barons, the continental barons, let's say, and which is led by Salerno, and Romualdo intervenes in defense of his own city, of his archbishop, against William, who wants to destroy it. He in fact sends a fleet to blockade Salerno and eventually disembark the troops and completely destroy the city. As Romualdo formulates this event, he again very much emphasizes his own agency. Romualdo is he likes to be the protagonist of history. He likes to write when he's there, and probably overemphasizing himself. But he writes that he instead petitioned the king and eventually convinced him to spare Salerno. Other sources say that the fleet of William I really was wrecked by a storm. So where the truth lies will have to be more research on this point of view. But no, in the sense that he really is careful in emphasizing the role of the Sicilian kings, especially William II and William I, as really much the center of universal history to an extent, because they managed to get this close to the truly universal leaders of the time, the Pope and the Emperor, and act in negotiation to resolve a universal crisis, like a worldwide crisis, we will say, with modern terms, that is the schism and the Barbarossa's wars.
Okay, thank you for correcting, and sorry for my mistake. Yeah, I don't see any further questions. So I would say that's about it. I thank you very much for your talk, for presenting your paper. And regarding the fact that we have a live conference as well, maybe we cross our ways in Trier in the near future.
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish you all the best for your research, and thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this opportunity.
Ciao, Gabriele.